Thanks for joining AHRC New York City today as we host guests from the New York City Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities. We're excited that you've joined us for today's webinar on accessible communication. The estimated length of this webinar is 90 minutes, with time for question and answers both at the end of the presentation, but also as needed throughout the presentation. Please feel free to use that chat box to enter questions and answers, and we'll make sure that our presenters today see them. This presentation is also being recorded. A friendly reminder, since we're in webinar mode, attendees' videos are not part of the recording. In the weeks following the presentation, AHRC New York City hopes you can help us widely share this training recording across to your stakeholders and the general public so more people have information to help make accessible communication. I'd now like to officially introduce our presenters today, Wale Sabri and Arthur Jacobs, officially passing the baton to both of you for a technology track and the presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. And hello, everyone. My name is Wale Sabri. You can call me Wally or Wale, and I'm the Digital Accessibility Coordinator for the City of New York. Just a quick image description of myself. This is something that we encourage folks to do whenever they introduce themselves in meetings or events. It's for the benefit of folks who are blind or have low vision or folks who are joining by phone. So I'm just going to quickly describe myself. I'm currently sitting in my cubicle at work, and I am a Middle Eastern man in my mid-30s. With brownish hazelish eyes, long dark curly hair that I've been growing for almost 2 years now, but I have it tied up in a ponytail to look presentable. I'm wearing a headset, and I'm sitting on my chair and wearing a long sleeve button-up shirt that's a checkered pattern, and I'm told it is turquoise or bluish greenish, and I have the sleeves rolled up just be a little more comfortable. Arthur, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Sure. Arthur Jacobs, the housing coordinator at the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities. I'm a Caucasian male in my early 40s with blonde hair and blue eyes. Why don't I go ahead and describe the slides as well, the general layout?
Sounds good.
All right, so the general layout of our slide deck is as follows. In the upper left-hand corner, we have the MOPD logo. In the upper right-hand corner is a series of accessibility icons. In the lower left is our Twitter handle, which is at NYC Disabilities. And the lower right is our web address, which is nyc.gov/disabilities. And the title slides have an image in the background of the city skyline looking up from the bottom of Manhattan.
Thank you, Arthur. So we'll just do a quick access check. So if you've made it this far, hopefully you can hear us all right and you can see us all right. If not, please do let us know. If you'd like to participate or ask us a question or comment, feel free to drop a message in the chat. I forgot, Sarah, did you say there's a Q&A panel as well that's available?
We do have time at the end, yep, for Q&A as needed.
Okay, I mean in Zoom if there's the Q&A panel enabled or not.
I apologize. There is Q&A. Yes, we have
cool.
open questions.
So feel free to either use the chat or the Q&A panel to submit your questions, and we'll try to stop periodically and answer questions. Towards the end, we'll be doing a sort of hopefully an interactive activity with y'all, where we'll be asking you quick questions about images as an image description exercise. We'll also be doing our best to describe images in the slides and reading the slide titles as we advance. And this is a practice that we hope you will adopt when you present as well, for the benefit, once again, of folks who are blind or have low vision, or folks who are joining by phone and don't have access to the slides. So currently the slide that we're on is called Access Check, and we're going to advance to the next slide. Okay, so today's agenda, this is what we're going to cover today. So accessible communications. We are mostly talking about digital communications when we say that today. So we're going to talk about how to make your content accessible. And first, we're going to cover wait one second. Okay, so sorry about that. The slide, of course, didn't want to read to me because I'm presenting, but it was reading earlier when I wasn't presenting. We're going to cover documents, emails, slide decks, and social media, how to make those types of content. If you're working with any documents, whether they're flyers, right, reports, one-sheeters, how to make those accessible. If you are drafting an email or an email blast, right, and you're including images and things of that nature, or an invitation to an event or a PDF, how to make the emails themselves accessible. If you're creating slides, such as we are creating slides today, how to make those as accessible as possible. And finally, if you're posting on social media, how to make your social media posts accessible. And when we say accessible, we mean accessible to people with disabilities, of course. And very quickly, we're talking about mostly disabilities that affect the eyes, ears, hands, and brain, right? So folks who are blind, folks who have hearing disabilities, such as folks who are deaf or hard of hearing, disabilities that affect the hands. So folks maybe who have trouble using a mouse or a keyboard and use alternative input devices, and folks, brain, meaning folks who have disabilities that affect their ability to process information, such as dyslexia or learning disability, or even just folks who have cognitive, intellectual, developmental disabilities as well. So let's get into it. So we're going to talk about some concepts that you should know for creating accessible documents and emails. There's a lot of similarities, so that's why we cover those specifically together first, and then we'll get into slides and then social media. But there is a lot of overlap of what we're going to talk about, because it's mainly the same things, just slightly altered for the type of content. So for documents and emails, we're going to first discuss fonts, how to make sure you're using accessible fonts, how to make sure your colors are easy to see and read, how to make your images accessible to folks who are blind, some formatting, how to properly format your documents and emails so that they're read correctly by screen readers and other assistive technologies, and how to write your content in a way that is more readable for folks with cognitive or intellectual disabilities, how to make your PDFs accessible, an introduction to that. We're not going to dive too deep into PDF accessibility, and email best practices. So just some more specific guidance about emails. And we're going to get in. Oh yeah, this is just this section, right? So after that, we'll cover slides and social media. So I'm going to hand it off to Arthur, who's going to get us started with some fonts, color contrast, and I'll come back for images.
All right, thank you, Wale. So font accessibility means that you're using a sans serif font. Some examples are Arial, Verdana, Tahoma, Helvetica, Avenir. Those are some very well-known examples. There are lots of sans serif fonts, but basically when we say sans serif font, we mean a font that doesn't have the little decorative things that kind of hang off the edges and corners and ends of the pieces of the font. So there's a graphic here on the screen with two Fs. The first F is a serif F, and the serifs are circled in red, so that the little decorative little hangers off on the edges and ends of the letter. And the right-hand F is a sans serif F, so it doesn't have those little decorative items. So we want fonts that do not have those because they're easier to read. And you want to maintain a minimum font size. If it's a document or an email, you want 12 points as a minimum. If it's going to be a large print document, you want 18 points as a minimum. And for PowerPoints or slide decks, you want 24 points. Color contrast minimums. So you want to make sure that your content is easily seeable in your communications. So you want to maintain a contrast between any text and the background behind that text of at least a 4.5:1 ratio. You can use a color contrast checker to check this, and we recommend the WebAIM color contrast checker, which is linked here on the slide. We will be providing this slide deck to everybody, so you'll have these links and references later on. Here's an example of what that color contrast checker kind of looks like. When you go there, you'll be able to input the information for the color. This by default uses the hex code. You can also click on the little color swatch and input the color in other ways, like RGB, or there are several different ways you can do it. And then it will give you the ratio on the right-hand side and an example of what that looks like in that box at the bottom, and then tell you on the left-hand side next to that box whether it passes the WCAG standards for AA, AAA, different standards there. And so this is a bad example here of contrast that is way below that 4.5 to 1 ratio. It's only 1.67 to 1. And you can see in that example box that it's very, very difficult to see the text on that background. This is a good example. We just adjusted the text color from black to white, and that brings our ratio up to almost 9 to 1, 8.73 to 1. The nice thing about this tool is that you can use the sliders to adjust and find that right combination that meets the contrast, and then input that into whatever you're using to create your content. All right, so Wale, we're back to you with images.
Thank you, Arthur. All right, so making your images accessible. So if you are inserting images into your documents or your emails or in your social media posts or slide decks as well, you should think about making them accessible. So beyond the same guidelines, right? If there are, if there's text in your image, right, you want to make sure that the font is a sans serif. And if there's, graphics on colors, you want to make sure that there's good color contrast for the image that you're creating. But if it's a photo, right, regardless of what kind of image it is, you want to make sure that you describe it for folks who are blind. And you can do that using what's called alt text, which stands for alternative text. This is a feature that will allow you to add a description to an image or an icon or a photo without it actually appearing on the screen. But when I get to it using my assistive technology, I use a screen reader. It reads aloud the content of the screen. And when I get to an image that has alt text, it will read the alt text, such as MOPD logo or Twitter logo, right? Or a photo of, people with disabilities marching in the parade, something in that vein. So, so here we have some old, I think these are old instructions. See. Oh yeah, actually these are instructions. If you use using Word and Office 365, you can just right click an image and then click edit alt text. And right there will be what you need, the description field. You just fill in a description there, and we'll walk you through what is actually a good description for an image. In older versions of Office, you might have to right click the image, then format picture, then go to alt text. So there's extra steps for older versions of. And there's a screenshot here of alt text being added to an image, right, in Microsoft Word. And the image that was being added alt text to is the New York City seal, by the way. Okay, so describing images. So there's many different types of images. How do you describe an image? So if it's a photo, here's some questions you can ask in order to generate some words and a description for yourself to put together and use that as your alt text. So ask yourself, where does this take place? When is it happening? Who's in the image? What are they doing? And most importantly, why are you using this image, right? If you are the one that is adding this image to your document, slide deck, or email or social media post, right? You are using it for a particular reason, right? There's a message that you want to convey by using this image. It could be something funny. It could be something that, is more meaningful, or, maybe you want to show that a lot of people showed up to your event, or maybe you want to show that your event had people from various backgrounds and ethnicities and, ability status, right? So here is an image that we have, and I'm gonna sort of answer the 5 questions, right? According to this image, right? So where is this, right? So you could say that this is in in New York City street, right? Or in park, outdoors, during the day, right? But we also know specifically, because this is our photo, this is the New York City Disability Pride Parade. When is very similar, right? When could be specific or general, right? So we know it's during the Disability Pride Parade, New York City Disability Pride Parade. But we could also say like it's during the day, right? During daytime, right? Who's in the image? Is it one person? Is it a group of people? Is it a well-known person like a celebrity or a politician or a famous historical figure? Or is it somebody that we don't know that we can describe maybe as, using their identity, which hopefully we know. Let's say it's like a somebody who identifies as a female, right? Or somebody who identifies as male, or you could also, if you know their races, you can include them. We encourage folks to describe race as much as possible. In this particular photo, right, it's a lot of people. It is probably hundreds, maybe even thousands of people with and without disabilities, right? More in this photo. What are they doing, right? They are okay, so what are they doing is they're kind of standing around, they're holding signs, right? They're waiting for this, they're also kind of like in a line. They're waiting for the start of the parade. So all together, right? Actually, why are we using, right? This image is the last one. And, we had this event. We want to show that, well, you missed out on this awesome event and there was a lot of people, right? And that it was also a lot of people with disabilities, right? Because it's the Disability Pride Parade. So we want to show that we were able to mobilize a lot of people with disabilities to go out in public and celebrate their disabilities. So what we have written here is photo taken at the New York City Disability Pride Parade in Union Square Park, period. Thousands of people with thousands of people with various disabilities wearing bright colors, holding signs and balloons await the start of the parade. Right? So here we have, a description that is kind of telling us a little bit of a story and giving us some background, right? And covering all the 5 questions that we just asked ourselves, including the why, right? So that is a little bit about how to describe images. We're going to give you some more tips. And also at the end, we are going to practice describing images together, hopefully, if we have time. Okay, so some tips for describing images. Okay, so for logos, right, you can just include the name and logo. So for, let's say, if you're inserting the AHRC logo, you could say AHRC logo or AHRC NYC logo. Our logo just has usually MOPD logo, or we write it out to be more official. So, the New York City Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities logo. Generally, you can do that with logos and not have to describe what they look like because, what the logo is generally is more important than what it looks like, right? Because you want to know what organization the email is coming from or the document was made by, and so on and so forth. Okay, so if you're writing acronyms in your alt text, and this is only in your alt text, you don't have to do this outside of your alt text, space them out. So instead of writing NYC without spaces, which is the way that we're used to writing it, just write N space Y space C. This is for the benefit of screen reader users because NYC, if it's not spaced out, it will be read as Nick. So quite often we are the Nick Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities, right? It makes more sense if we are the NYC, Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities. And the way to do that is to space out your acronyms in your alt text. So MOPD as well, we would space that out, M space O space P space D, and so on and so forth. For AHRC, we would also probably do that because screen readers pronounce AHRC as ARC. So you want to write AHRC in your alt text as A space H space R space C. Did I spell that right? AHRC. Anyway, you guys get the point. For graphs and pie charts, you want to give a general description. So you want to include the name of that graph or that pie chart. What is it depicting, right? And some of the significant data. So if it's a pie chart, what is the biggest slice and what's the smallest slice? If it's a graph, what is the highest value and the lowest value? What are the trends? Is it generally going up or is it generally going down? Is it kind of going, up and down like a bell curve? Or is it all over the place, right? You want to give folks in your alt text a sort of description that gives the bird's eye view of looking at that data. So for infographics, briefly describe what the images are, but you want to focus more on what is the messaging of this infographic, right? What is it trying to tell you? If it's winter weather safety tips, right, you should make sure that those are kind of more in the beginning of the alt text, and that the image descriptions or the images that are in that infographic are kind of mentioned more towards the end. And there's also something to be said about lengths of alt text. So for logos, they should be short. For photos, they should be relatively, I think, like moderate, right? But it also depends on the context. So we are, a government agency, so we are focused on getting people their services more than, visual aesthetics, right? So we will describe our photos in a minimal way because generally, they're just functional images. However, we do have some art galleries up on our website. We have a disability rights, sort of a New York City disability rights history exhibit, and that we've digitalized, right? And in those are more art related, right? Images, and there the art is the meaning, right? So you want to use the context, right? So if it's something that's more artsy, it's okay to have a longer alt text and give more of the details, right? If something is more functional, it's just kind of maybe a document that is giving information about a program or something like that, or how to apply for something. You definitely don't want people spending, writing an essay as the alt text, right? Because people are just trying to get to the information of how to apply for this program, or, they're looking for some specific information. Whereas, something more artistic, it's more about being immersed in the experience. Therefore, it's okay to have longer alt text there. There is also something called decorative images, or it's a concept, right? Sometimes we have images that are just there to make the content look good. It could be a vertical bar or a horizontal bar, right? To separate parts of the content. It could be a ribbon in the background or a watermark, right? Generally, those things don't add a lot of meaning for people who are blind or use screen readers, so you can actually hide them. In Microsoft Word and Outlook and Office generally, there is, when you go to the alt text section, there's a checkbox to mark it as decorative, and that will hide it from screen readers. But we find that the best way to mark something as decorative is to actually just in the description field, in the alt text description field, just add, make sure that field is empty and just add a space in there. Just press space bar once. That will hide it from all screen readers. We find that if you use the decorative feature in Microsoft Office, some screen readers will count it as hidden. Some screen readers will just read it as a star. So there's just some inconsistent behaviors there, but we found that the most consistent way to hide an image from a screen reader is just by making sure the alt text is blank and then inserting a space in there. Sorry, I'm taking long here. How are we doing on time? 2:26, 2:30. Okay, so we still got an hour and a half. All right, so semantic formatting. So now we're gonna get into how you should format your document so that it is more readable by assistive technologies and presents the way that it should to people with disabilities in a way that makes sense, right? That kind of is equivalent to what you're seeing when you look at a document. So we're gonna get into headings, lists, hyperlinks, tables, tables of contents, right? These are all things that we use to create our documents and make them, helpful or navigable, right? And so we're going to get into those. So okay, so I'm going to start talking about headings, and then I believe I'm going to hand it over to Arthur, who is going to also continue talking about headings and then move on to the next areas. So headings are very important for documents, specifically for web pages, I would say, and some emails as well. It depends on how long your emails are. But headings act as sort of bookmarks for everybody, right? For sighted users, but also for people who use assistive technologies or people who are blind. So just like in the same way that if you're a sighted user and you're looking at a document, you might be able to pick out text that's bigger and bold easier, so you can skip to that section, right? That's how headings work. In the same way, if the headings are formatted properly, I can also navigate from heading to heading so that I can skim a document quickly and get to the information that I'm looking for. Unfortunately, a lot of folks do not format headings correctly. Making this font bigger and making it bold doesn't actually give it a proper heading tag. And a lot of folks who are designers or content creators or marketing folks, that's how they make their headings, right? Because if it looks like it, then it might as well be it. Unfortunately, that's not how it works for assistive technology, and that is bad practice for accessibility. You need to use proper heading tags, as I said before. In Microsoft Word, there are built-in styles. So in the styles pane, which is in the home ribbon under, I think, paragraphs or styles pane, there you can choose things like heading 1, heading 2, heading 3, and you can change the visual aesthetic of these headings. But first you need to apply the style so that the formatting, proper formatting is added to the text, right? And then you can change the way that it looks if you don't like the way that it looks. In PDFs, right, you need to make sure that headings have proper heading tags. And that's a little bit more complicated, but if you're using something like InDesign, there is a way to do that by creating your own styles and giving things the proper tags. So just there's a screenshot here of adding that, and as well adding a heading using the styles pane. And there's instructions as well. So you would select the text that you want to make into a heading. Then in the home tab, you can navigate to the styles pane. And then you can choose an appropriate heading level, heading 1, heading 2, heading 3. And we're going to also talk about heading hierarchies, how you should be using heading 1s, heading 2s, and heading 3s, because they're not all the same. Okay, so that's actually what I'm going to get into next before I hand it off to Arthur. Okay, so heading structure, think of it as the sort of outline of your entire document. So there are heading 1s. These are the biggest headings, or I would say call them the broadest headings. So you can use your heading 1, for instance, for the title of your document. Or if your document has chapters. Absolutely. So somebody asked, do Google Docs and other word processing softwares have the same accessibility features? Yes, they do. At least Google Docs for sure. iWorks also. So Pages does support accessibility. InDesign, those are the ones that we know of for sure and have experience with. If you're using something else, then you might want to look that up. So you might want to look up the platform, the software name and accessibility, just to find out. But yeah, that is a great question. So once again, right, headings, so heading structures. So the broadest level would be heading 1, and you would use that for maybe the title of the document, or if it's a long document with chapters, then you would use heading 1s for the chapter titles. Heading 2s would be subsections, all right? So if your chapters are heading 1s, so, chapter 1, introduction, and then there's sections within that chapter, those would be heading level 2s. So in your introduction, maybe you're writing a report on accessibility in New York City, right? Some heading 2s could be accessible housing, right? Accessible transportation, accessible education, right? And even if those have subheadings, right? Let's say in housing, right? Accessible housing is your heading level 2, right? Inside your chapter 1, right? Introduction. So if you have a sections within your accessible housing section, those would be heading level 3s, right? So let's say inside accessible housing, you have progress adding, accessible and affordable housing since 2020, right? Or something of that nature. And so if you notice, we're trying to follow a hierarchy, and we don't want to skip heading levels. So you don't want to have a heading 1 followed by a heading 3 or a 4. If you have a heading 1 and you have sections within that, area, you go to heading 2, right? And if it breaks down smaller into more sections within that heading 2, then it goes to heading, want to use heading 3s. And then if there's even more, and we've made documents where we'll go all the way to heading level 5s, honestly. But you want to follow that structure, that hierarchy, so that blind people, when they read your documents, they're able to have some familiar rules, right, for their heading structures. Because what's often found on the internet and in many documents is the heading structure is all over the place. You'll have a title that's a heading level 6, which is, the least important type of heading, right? At least to screen reader users. So you want to make sure that, you are aware of these rules and you are kind of abiding by them appropriately. And you can always reach out to us for guidance. We're happy to look at any documents that you've created and just give you a quick rundown of what you did right and what you need to change. Okay, so that is heading structures. And then we have some examples of what it's like to use improperly formatted headings. And then we're showing you how to, what it also, what the reading experience basically for a blind person is like when the headings are not formatted correctly, and then when they are formatted correctly. And Arthur is just going to quickly describe those two images. First, we're going to talk about a bad example.
All right, thank you, Ole. So as you see, there's a screenshot with 2 separate layouts. On the left-hand side, I've indicated what kind of style or semantic structure has been assigned to the individual pieces of text. And you'll see in this bad example that they're all just plain paragraphs. The P tag represents paragraphs. So when a screen reader encounters it, it's just going to see this as text. It's not going to give it any kind of extra information for the user, semantic, structural information for the user. It's just going to be presented as plain text. So on the right-hand side, this is what the screen reader would say to the user who's reading it. So it's going to say introduction to headings. It's not going to say anything about that being a title or a heading level 1 or anything. And so here is a good example, the example where those semantic structures have been added. And so you'll see on the left-hand side, you've got those those tags, those semantic tags that are added when you use the styles in Word. So that the introduction to headings is in H1, then you've got a paragraph, then an H2, then an H3 with the paragraph, and then another H3 with the paragraph. So you'll notice it's not that every heading should go in chronological order, H1, H2, H3, every time you come to a heading. It really has to do with the outline level of that information. So think about, creating an outline of the information. Your H1 is your top level, so chapters in a long document or title in a short document. And then subsections of the H1 is going to be in H2, and subsections of the H2 will be in H3. So in the on the right-hand side, you've got the same information as it's presented, but I put in parentheses what the screen reader would say in addition to that information. So introduction to headings, heading level 1. Then top level headings, heading level 2. Short documents, heading level 3. Docs with a table of contents, heading level 3. So all of those are going to be presented to the screen reader as a heading that's going to let the user know that, that is a heading and what level in the outline structure or heading structure that you're looking at. Some tips for headings when you're creating headings. Don't use too many headings. Remember, headings should be used to mark sections of the document that a reader would want to jump to. Formatting too many headings can defeat that purpose, for using them for navigation. So if everything is a heading, then you may as well have no headings, right? Or if almost everything is a heading, you may as well have no heading. So think about it from that navigation standpoint. A screen reader user or keyboard user is really going to be using them for quick navigation to be able to skim the document. So you want to think about where you want to break up those points. Don't format list items as headings. It's either formatted, either you're going to format it as a list or you're going to format it as a heading, not both. So that's one or the other. You don't want to confuse those two because they're two totally different semantic structures and the screen reader handles them differently. And if you do, if you format a list item as a heading, then the screen reader is not really going to know, is it a list, is it a heading? It can't, it's not supposed to be both. All right, so formatting lists. You want to use lists to break up large boxes of text. This is kind of a design best practice so that you don't have huge long chunks of text that are hard to read through and get the information. And when you're doing lists, you want to use the built-in list functionality that's on the ribbon in Microsoft Office. So you want to place the cursor where you would like to start your list. You can go to the Home tab, navigate to Paragraph Group, and then select the Bullets button, or if you want a numbered list, you can do the Numbered List button. You can also type out the information that you want and then highlight it and then choose bullets or numbers, and it will automatically format it for you. You want to do it this way because the screen readers, the semantic structure that's built underneath, on the back end will be correct when you do it this way. Whereas if you use just the list styles in the list pane or in the styles pane, it doesn't always translate correctly. So it's better just to use the built-in list functionality in Word or in Office generally. So when you're formatting hyperlinks, you want to make sure that you make URLs into a hyperlink so that they're easier to access. To do this, you select the text that you would like to be a hyperlink, right click and choose hyperlink, or sometimes it'll say just link, and then paste in the URL in the field labeled address. And you can use the text to display field to change the text label for that link. So if you don't want the full URL, for instance, http:// blah, 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 you can change it to a shorter version of that, maybe just nyc.gov instead of http:// www. Or if it's not a URL that you want to be seen, but you want it to describe where the link goes, you could say, NYC homepage or MOPD homepage, or wherever that link takes you to, you can use that as the descriptive text to display. There's a keyboard shortcut to create the heading. You'll press Control K to add a hyperlink, and I believe you have to highlight the text first before you do that. Or if you haven't typed it out yet, you could press Control K, and then you can use the text to display and the address boxes to input all the information, and then it'll show up for you. Note, you want to use unique and descriptive labels. So avoid simply click here or learn more or more, you know. You want people to know where that link takes them just by reading the link label itself. So if that's the URL, that's fine. If it's, you know, MOPD website, you know, that's fine too. Accessible tables. So tables should not, first off, tables should not be used for layout purposes, even in emails. So you want to avoid using tables for layout purposes. I know sometimes when you're using like the mass email, constant contacts, those sorts of things, sometimes you don't have a choice. They just automatically do it for you. But we want to try to avoid tables in emails as well as in documents. You can use in Microsoft Word, you can use the columns feature to format if you want to break things up into multiple columns, but you don't want to use tables. You also don't want to use text boxes. I'm just going to throw this in there. We're going to talk about this a little later, but don't want to use text boxes either because those are not accessible. They should only be used to show tabular data. Some examples of tabular data include schedules, statistics, charts, etc. And you want to be sure the headers are defined. So the table header, the column headers and the row headers are defined. And you can do that on the ribbon in Microsoft Word. For Microsoft Word, for table row header or column header, sorry, you'll want to choose repeat column header on every page. That will mark it as a column header. And then for row header, I believe there's a check mark on the left-hand side of the table formatting part of the ribbon that says row header. Tables of contents. So if your document is longer than 3 or 4 pages, you'll want to include a table of contents. And that makes it easier and more accessible to navigate. If you do have created headings using the heading styles, you can generate a table of contents automatically. To do this, you go to the References tab, navigate to Table of Contents, and then choose one of the options there. And it will display, usually it's 3 heading levels worth in the table. If you do the custom, you can choose how many heading levels it's going to display. And you can always, once it generates it, if it generated extra heading levels that you don't want, you can always just delete them. And you can have it update the page numbers throughout. So as you add content, you just choose update page numbers and it will automatically update them. All right, so things to avoid. Wale, back to you.
Thank you. Alrighty, so here's some things to avoid when creating a document or an email, but this is we wrote the slide specifically for using Microsoft Word, so not all of it might be relevant to the software that you're using at the time, right? So in Office and Microsoft Word, the flowchart feature is not accessible. So if you are going to create something like that, don't use that feature. Use some kind of alternative way to do that. Something text-based that is not that feature. Don't use the flowchart feature. The text box feature, even though the name is kind of very misleading, because usually things that are text are accessible, but the text box feature specifically makes things less accessible. So avoid using text boxes. I have not specifically looked at the flowchart features in PowerPoint, but if I were to guess, I would be very confident in saying that it's probably not accessible. If it's not accessible in Word, it's probably not accessible in PowerPoint. What you can do for that though, is if you turn it into an image, right? So you can create the flow chart and turn it into an image, and then put that image on your slide and give it all text. It's just when you use those features, they create a lot of extra nonsense for screen readers that just doesn't make sense. So if you do create like something like that, just turn it into an image and add all text to it, and that's how you make it accessible.
Hi, it's Sarah. Just a quick time check that we're at 2:50.
Okay, and we have time until 4, correct?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Avoid creating complex or nested tables. So a table within a table within a table. That's just generally hard to get your head around in general. But when you're trying to navigate something like that with a screen reader, it just gets extremely confusing and the information will not be accessible. Even though it is technically accessible, it'll just be too confusing to understand. So don't use nested tables, right? Just use regular a table that's showing pretty much, one type of thing and, doesn't have multiple levels of tables inside of it. Avoid using fillable fields. That's in Microsoft Word specifically. Those tend to be not accessible. You can create PDFs with fillable fields that are accessible. It takes a bit more work, and we can probably do a 2 to 4 hour training just on how to create a PDF with fillable form fields that's accessible. Well, we don't have that time today, unfortunately, so we will be a bit more brief when we talk about that. Next slide. Okay, some content creation. So this is in this section, we're now going to cover how to make your content more readable. So this is when you're writing your content, right? How should you write it? So first we covered how should your content look in terms of font and colors, right? And images, how to make those accessible. Then we covered how to format your content for accessibility. And now we're just going to talk about how to actually write your content using things like plain language and other tips. So avoid using all caps except for acronyms. So AHRC, you can have that in all caps, but your slogan, or if you have a slogan, I don't know. Let's say our slogan, MOPD, right, is to make New York City the most accessible city in the world. And maybe we want to yell that off the two rooftops, right? But we don't want to put that in all caps because all caps is more difficult to read for folks with print disabilities. Print disabilities could be somebody with low vision, somebody with dyslexia, learning disability, right? So just avoid using all caps for headings, statements, slogans, right? Only use all caps for acronyms. Avoid using large blocks of text because they're dense and just are not very approachable, right? Nobody wants to read a huge paragraph that you wrote. Generally because it just seems a bit daunting as something content to read. What would make it more approachable if you broke down that large block of text using headings, paragraphs, and lists. So we talked about those earlier, right? That way folks can kind of get a better understanding of what's in your document and skim it more easily. If your document is 8 pages and those 8 pages are 1 paragraph long, right? People aren't going to be able to find things in your document very easily. But if you break it up, you use headings, right? Smaller paragraphs and even lists, right? That makes things more easier to follow and to digest, especially for lists, right? If you are going to name a bunch of things, and I do this all the time, I will write a paragraph and the paragraph will go something like this. The 7 pillars of accessible NYC are accessible housing, accessible, I won't say accessible every time, but they are housing, transportation, education, financial empowerment, access to city services, right? I'm forgetting some, Arthur, but instead of writing that in paragraph form, right, you can say the 7 pillars of accessible NYC are, and then start a list, right, and list them all individually. That'll make them easier to, especially if it's, since there's 7 of them, right? It's easier to kind of break down and digest if you're reading one of them at a time instead of them in an entire sentence or a paragraph. Use plain language, and that is what I'm going to get into in the next few slides, so I'm not going to spend time on it now. All right, top 10 principles of plain language. So this is very beneficial for folks who have cognitive, intellectual, or developmental disabilities, folks who have learning disabilities or dyslexia, folks who are, and yeah, we are in New York as well. So we do have a lot of folks with limited English proficiency. So plain language really does help out a lot of folks. And what is plain language? The official definition of plain language is text that can be understood by everyone from the first read, right? And that's very important, right? The first read and everyone, right? So how do we do that, right? How do we write in a way that could be understood by everyone from the first time they read it? Here are some principles brought to you by plainlanguage.gov. So there's a question between, is there a difference between plain language and easy read? I actually have not heard the term easy read being used a lot, so I would not give you an answer just because I don't want to be wrong in this instance, but we can always look that up and find out. But I have a feeling that maybe easy read is maybe easy read is a plain language way of saying plain language. I don't know. But like I said, maybe it would be worth asking those folks why they use that specific term and if there's any difference. Okay, so one, write for your reader, not for yourself. This is something that we kind of forget to do a lot, right? Sometimes we're just writing something and we're just writing it in the way that we understand it. But we need to write in the way that other folks will understand it. That includes putting in details, for instance, that for us might be common knowledge or common sense. Use pronouns when you can, he, she, they. They're very hot. It's a very hot topic, lately, but also it just makes language easier to understand as opposed to, New Yorkers can apply for a rent freeze if they're eligible tenants and blah, 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 blah. You can just say, you can apply for a rent freeze, right? You can freeze your rent and save money on your rent, right? That's very more direct, right? And easier to understand, especially when we're talking about, like I said, we're in New York City for folks with limited English proficiency. State your major points first before getting into your details. So if you've been following us today, before we get into any section, right, we told you what we were going to talk about in that section, right? And then we broke it down in more detail. That's very helpful, right? We did that for the entire presentation as well. We said, this is what we're going to cover in the entire presentation, right? And then we started taking each topic. And then for each section, right, we said what we're going to cover for that section, right? So just kind of constantly giving folks a roadmap of what is to come, what is ahead, right? So that folks can keep track, right? And sometimes we zone out. I do it all the time, especially if folks are speaking a lot. So I wouldn't be surprised if some folks zoned out today, right? And if we are kind of keeping folks in check by just checking in and letting folks know, this is what we're going to talk about now, right? And this is what we're going to talk about in the following few slides. It's just helpful for keeping folks, in track and keeping their attention. Stick to your topic. Try not to go off on tangents. I hope we demonstrated that today. I might have gone off on 1 or 2 tangents here and there, but mostly we tried to stay on topic. If there's something that you feel the need to say strongly, right, try the best as you can. Maybe if you can write it down as well, so you don't forget it, right? Try to hold that comment until you get to the appropriate section so that you're giving folks the right information at the right time. Limit each paragraph to one idea and keep it short. So that goes along with avoid large blocks of text. This will help you avoid large blocks of text because if you keep each paragraph to one idea, then you're going to be able to have an easier time kind of keeping your paragraphs, 4 or 5 sentences long or 3 sentences or whatever. Next slide is the second set of principles. So principles 6 through 10. So write in the active voice. I actually demonstrated this earlier when I was talking about pronouns. I actually used you, right? You can apply for a rent freeze, right? That is more digestible and easier to understand because it's more direct as opposed to, tenants who are living in 30% below the poverty line can now apply for a rent freeze, right? Or, you can apply for a rent freeze if you have low income, right? That's a little bit easier to digest. Use short sentences as much as possible. I'm a huge fan of this. I do not like long run-on sentences. I'm often breaking up my sentences into 3 sentences. And so use shorter sentences and, try to use less technical language as well. Use more common words that people understand. All right. We still haven't fixed this typo. If you must use technical terms, not technology terms, if you must use technical terms, I'm using an old slide deck. If you must use technical terms, define them the first time you talk about them, right? So if you're gonna start talking about modal dialogues, maybe you want to tell people what modal dialogues are first before you tell people how to make them accessible so that we're all on the same page, right? Omit unneeded words. I'm a big fan of this too. If a word is actually not serving a purpose in your sentence, other than it's making your sentence longer and making you sound a little bit smarter, it's actually not adding meaning to the text, right, to your content, and it might actually throw people off if they don't know what it means, right? So you want to only use necessary words, right, and omit any unneeded words. Keep the subject and verb close together. I think this also goes in hand with keeping your sentences short. I don't really have a good example of this. Arthur, do you have a good example, or we could just move on as well? Okay. You're muted, so I don't know what you're saying, but it sounds like you don't.
I don't.
Okay, well, it's your slide anyway, accessibility checker. So now we're going to show you some tips about how to use the accessibility checker, but also to not use that as your end all be all. That should be your one of your final steps anyway. Yes.
All right, thank you. So you do want to always use the accessibility checker because it will make sure that you haven't missed any kind of obvious things. You can go to the review tag and choose check accessibility. But as Wale pointed out, it's not the end all be all. It's not a perfect thing that will catch everything and not catch things that aren't errors. So it can be inaccurate, but it does give you a sense of the accessibility for the document. For instance, if your heading structure is off, it will probably point that out to you pretty well. If your images are missing alt text, it will most likely point that out as well. But again, it's not perfect. It can be inaccurate. It will show you things that aren't errors as errors, and it will miss things that are errors. There are certain things it can't check for. For instance, it cannot check for color contrast. So those are things that you have to check manually, but it is a good starting point to use. And all of the Office products have accessibility checkers. I think Adobe products also have accessibility checkers. I'm not sure about Google products and other things, but All right. So exporting to PDF. So creating a PDF from this is specifically from your Word document or from your PowerPoint. You can create an accessible Word document by saving it as an accessible PDF. So you're not going to print it to PDF, you're going to save it as PDF. So you go to the File tab and choose Save As. You'll navigate to the file type and choose PDF, and then choose the More Options, which will bring up another dialog box, and then you'll choose Options. And this is on Windows. We found out that this doesn't exist on Mac for some reason. I don't know why, but this is for Windows specifically. Under Options, you want to be sure that document properties and document structure tags for accessibility are both checked. So there'll be some additional options there, and you want to make sure those two are checked. By default, typically they are, but you just want to make sure. You'll only have to do that the first time. Once they are checked, they will remain checked unless somebody changes them. So what do we mean when we say an accessible PDF? Accessible PDFs have certain document properties assigned to them. They have tagged headings, lists, links, and tables that are all properly tagged. They have alt text for their images, and they have a proper reading order assigned. I'm going to go a little, that's not the only, this is one of those kind of overall overview slides that we have from another deck. So I'm going to go a little bit into detail since we don't have it here. So you want to make sure, document properties, the big ones are that it has a title and that it is set to display as, single page continuous. These are some basic things that language is set. Again, you want to make sure that your headings are tagged properly so that they're tagged in the proper order. So you have, in H1 that your H2s are supposed to be H2s and H3s are supposed to be H3s, etc. That links are tagged properly. Lists are, particularly nested lists, are tagged as well, in tables. And then alt text for images, every image should have alt text. And if it's not an image that you want to describe because it's decorative, that image is, or that decorative item is artifact, set to be an artifact. And then reading order, basically you just want to make sure that the reading order for the content and the tabs and the tags, and the tags are essentially the same, that they match and that they are logical throughout the document. All right, accessible emails, Wale.
Thank you, Arthur. Okay, so accessible emails generally have a lot of the same things that we've already went through, right? You want to make sure you're using accessible fonts. You want to make sure that you have good color contrast or high color contrast. If you are inserting images, you want to make sure that they have alt text. And if your email is long, you want to make sure to break it up using headings, paragraphs, and lists. Also, the links in your email should probably have, just be tagged correctly. And it's generally better if they have text labels instead of, inserting the URL, unless the URL is something short like, ahrc.org or something like that. All right, so some on top of, what we already know, here's some specific things to keep in mind for emails. So avoid using tables for layout. We kind of covered this with documents, but it comes up with emails a lot. A lot of the email services that you can get, such as like MailChimp, right? So these kind of like email promotional services that help you, draft an email that looks like professional and sends it to a whole bunch of people. A lot of them use tables as their layouts. So if you can, wherever you can, try to use, avoid using a table layout. Avoid using images of invitations or sending that in an email. But if you are going to use that, just make sure to make it accessible. What do I mean by when I say that? Specifically, what's an image invitation? So have you ever gotten an invitation and it's an email and it says you're cordially invited to, and then in the body, it's just an image, right? The flyer. So what that sounds like to a screen reader is you're cordially invited to the subject line, right? And then you get it to the body and it's event flyer _.jpg, and that is it. So it's not accessible. I don't know what event I'm being invited to, or how to get there, how to RSVP, when is it? I don't know anything about this event because all they did was just insert the flyer as a JPEG or a TIFF, and they did not add alt text to it. So if you do that, the way to make it accessible is to add alt text. And in your alt text, you want to include all of the text that is in the image. So the title, the description, the date, the time, how to register, accessibility information, everything that is text on that image should be in your alt text. Okay, so I did say that. And don't forget about your email signature. That's something that we forget all the time. So if you do have an email signature and that has your, let's say, company logo in it, don't forget to add alt text to it, right? Maybe it has another kind of image that's promoting a program or, the time of year or something like that. Don't forget to add alt text to your images that are part of your signature. So if you do that, and if you want to make sure you do that, is you can right click the image and add alt text to it, right? The same way as before. And then once you've done that, I think you have to actually send an email to yourself with that image and the alt text. Then you can actually drag that image from the email that you sent to yourself into your email signature field area, and then it will preserve the alt text there. I know it's a little convoluted, but if you're having trouble, just I'm sure if you search the internet for how to add alt text to your signature, you'll be able to figure it out or find some guidance there. Next slide. Accessible slide decks. You're doing this, right? Yes. So I'm going to hand it back over to you and then come back for social media.
All
Just
right.
a quick, sorry, Arthur, just a quick time check that we're at 3:13.
Okay, great. So we're going to talk now about accessible slide decks. As part of that, we're going to talk specifically about master slides and layouts and the reading order. All right, master slide and layouts. So in PowerPoint specifically, there is a feature called a master slide that you can use and should use as the starting point for creating your slide deck. And within that, you can have layouts that are associated with those master slides. So you want to use the master slide to design the overall look of your presentation. And then use the layouts to design the overall slide types or the overall layout for different kinds of slide types. So for instance, on this presentation, we have a title slide layout, we have a title and content layout, and then we have a title only layout. And I think there's a title and 2 content, like a 2-column layout. Those are the main layouts that we have for this slide. The master slide itself is really just the background color. That's all that's on there. So you want to, is in your layouts, you want to make sure that you use placeholder text, so for titles and body fields, so that when it's presented to a screen reader user, either in PowerPoint or when it converts to PDF, it has that semantic structure built into it. So title is automatically going to be assigned a header tag, and body fields are automatically going to be seen as regular text. And then elements that repeat should be part of the master layout or a master slide, not on individual slides. So for instance, in this slide deck, all of the graphics and our website, our Twitter handle, those are all part of the master slide layout and not on these slides individually. And you can find examples or templates for accessible PowerPoint slides at this link here. And again, as a reminder, we will be providing this deck to you, so you'll have that information. The other thing you want to be aware of is the reading order for each slide. So to do this, you want to use the selection pane to make sure that the reading order is logical. To get to the selection pane, you go to the Home tab on the ribbon, go to the Drawing group, and then click on Arrange, and that will pop up a little menu. At the very bottom of that menu, you'll see Selection Pane. Now, this is a little bit convoluted, we understand, but for whatever reason, this is the way that PowerPoint has designed its interface. Screen readers will present the elements in that selection pane from the bottom to the top. So the last item in the selection pane is going to be read to the screen reader first, and then it's going to go up from there. So you want to make sure that the title is always the very last item in that list. Then the body or any relevant images should also be near the bottom. So typically on these slides, anything that's in the master slide or master layout isn't going to be, you're not going to see it in that selection pane. So it's automatically going to be hidden from a screen reader, which is why you want to use it for that repetitive stuff. So that it doesn't, become repetitive. But on these slides, there's really only 2 or 3 things in that selection pane. The very bottom is the title, then the text box, and then if there's an image, the image. And that's really it. And it's in that order from bottom to top. All right, so again, repeating content such as logos, Twitter handles, websites, should be in the master slide layout, just as a final reminder. All right, social media accessibility, Wale.
Thank you, Arthur. Okay, so and I just want to reiterate, right, for slides, you want to keep in mind all of the things that we said before about using accessible fonts. Minimum font size of 24 points. That means the smallest font you should use in a slide is 24 points. You should have high color contrast for all of your slides, right? And you should have alt text for all of the images in your slides, except for the decorative ones. We have actually the logos for MOPD and Twitter and the accessibility icons. We actually hide them in the subsequent slides. So we only have them available to screen readers in the first and last slide, I believe, or maybe the first few slides. But once we actually start going into the content of the presentation where we're talking about, guidance and stuff like that, and giving you tips, right? We actually are hiding the icons, the Twitter logo, the MOPD logo, the accessibility icons, because it makes it a cleaner reading experience for folks who are blind and don't need to hear that repeated over and over again every time they switch slides, right? For some folks who are visual, right, you can see that and you can ignore it. But for folks who are using a screen reader, they're going to have to read it every single time, right? So that's why it's good to hide anything that's going to be repeating content on every slides. So I hope that makes sense and that wasn't too convoluted. Now we're going to get into social media, right? So for social media, there's a few things to keep in mind. Mainly, you want to, on social media, we use images a lot. So we want to make sure that we are adding alt text to our images. But we're also creating graphics, right? So our graphics should also use accessible fonts and have high color contrast. And, hopefully use plain language as well. Some other tips about social media: if you're using a hashtag, use what is called camel case, as in camel, the animal. And that is basically capitalizing the first letter of every word. So if you're using a hashtag that is multiple words, I'm having trouble thinking of a hashtag that's multiple words. Accessibility is great, as Arthur says. Okay, so that's the hashtag. So, if you're writing hashtag accessibility is great, the A in accessibility would be capital, the I in is, it would be capital, and the G in great would be capital. That will make it easier to read visually, but it'll also be easier to read with a screen reader because a screen reader will read those as individual words. If you do not capitalize the I and the G, it will probably try to pronounce the entire thing as one word, which I can't even guess what it would sound like, but it would be unintelligible. So that's why it's important to use camel case when you're using hashtags. Just capitalize the first letter of every word, not every other letter, right? And not random letters, just the first letter of every word. Avoid using, I think they're called ASCII characters, ASCII. Correct me if I'm misspelling it. And those are the sort of, I like to call them somewhere between, computer sort of looking characters to emojis to all other languages like Cyrillic, right? And we see this a lot on social media. Folks will use these other kind of fonts because Twitter doesn't actually, from what I understand, Twitter doesn't let you change the font that you use in your tweets, so that folks use these ASCII characters to use a different font that maybe looks like more mathy or like more sciencey, or sometimes they have Cyrillic letters, right? And so what that does for accessibility is it makes the content that whatever you write in those characters will be very unintelligible and not very easy to read. So why is that? Because it will read each one as an individual character instead of a word, right? So let's say you wrote a word and the word is math. Then it's going to read every character depending on which font you're using, but this is one example, right? It's going to say mathematical capital letter M, mathematical capital letter A, mathematical capital letter T, mathematical capital letter H. And that's how I'll read the word math if you use those types of fonts. So I hope I explained the fonts correctly, just so you guys know. If you have questions, if you still don't know which fonts I'm talking about, drop a question in the chat and maybe Arthur will have some better examples for you. So now that I've covered some kind of basics about social media, we know well, we will be describing images, right? If we insert them in our posts. Oh, and here's how you do that. So, so actually here are the platforms that we know for sure support alt text. That's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. There are other ones like Tumblr and I believe there's actually, that I don't want to say any other ones that would just be a guess, but Tumblr does support alt text. I think Medium, but those are more like blogging websites. And so all of them do support alt text. And here are instructions on how to add alt text on Twitter. And there's an image of it as well. So these, I believe, are old instructions. So we do have to update that. Right now, I think for Twitter, as soon as you add an image, there will be options for it to add, you can edit the image, you can delete it, or you can add alt text to it. But it used to be that you used to have to go into settings and turn alt text on in order for it to appear when you're composing a tweet. I believe that is no longer the case, but do correct me if I'm wrong. You can also add alt text to GIFs, by the way, GIF, GIFs. Something for you to know, the Twitter GIF library does have embedded descriptions in them. So there's usually something small, like 2 or 3 words for each GIF, such as like Fresh Prince Carlton dancing or something. That's one of my favorite GIFs. But it's not actually describing what's in it. So I would recommend that if you are using a GIF, do edit the alt text and be a little bit more descriptive, so that's a better experience for somebody who's blind and is reading your tweet. This is how to add alt text on Facebook. There's a screenshot of it as well. On desktop, I believe as you're composing, if you add an image, you can edit the alt text for it. On mobile, you actually have to post, if you're using the Facebook app on iPhone, let's say, you actually have to post the image, then go back to the post after it's live, and tap the image, go to override edit alt text, and then you can change by choosing override alt text and then typing in the field. So Facebook has its own auto description feature. It tries to use AI to describe images, and it is awful. So don't ever rely on Facebook to describe your images for you. You might actually have the wrong thing in there, or might have something that is just not helpful, right? Or maybe even embarrassing for you. So you want to make sure that you're in control of what your images are saying to blind people, right? And that they're saying something that is, 1, correct, and 2, appropriate. But I mean, not that they would add any vulgar things in there, but if it misrecognizes somebody as an animal, that's not a good thing, right? If it misrecognizes a body part as a food, right, that is not a good thing that you want your post to be telling people, right? So do make sure to override the alt text when using Facebook and Instagram, because Instagram does have this feature as well. This is how to add alt text on Instagram. It's a screenshot of it, but basically, as you're composing a post, on the very last screen, there's a button labeled advanced. You tap that and you scroll down, go to compose alt text, and you can add it right there. And if you have multiple images in your post, each one will have its own box that you can add alt text. So you can add alt text to multiple images at once if you're posting multiple images. You could do the same with Twitter as well and Facebook, just FYI. I forgot to mention that the alt text on Twitter doesn't count towards your character limit for your tweet. You have actually 1,000 characters for your alt text on Twitter, which is separate from your actual tweet. So that's in case somebody was wondering about that. And here is how to add alt text on LinkedIn. Select an image, and then select add description at the top right hand. It should be at the top right hand side of your image. And that is LinkedIn. If you use something like Hootsuite, Hootsuite does support alt text for Twitter, and I believe they were working on Instagram. But do look into, if you use one of those scheduler programs, look into the accessibility and look at whether it supports alt text. If they don't, reach out to them. Let them know that that's a feature that you want because you care about accessibility. All right. So we are at 3:25. We were thinking of doing a fun activity and just going through some images with you all and asking you to answer the questions in the chat. But basically, we're just going to be like, who is this? Who is this? Where is this? Where is this? What is this? What are they doing? And it's just as an example for you to kind of learn. So Sarah, let me know if that's what you want to do, or we could just stop for questions now.
I would defer to participants, but I do want to make sure we get people's time questions in, because I know we've been on for about an hour and a half here, Wale. So
okay.
Why don't we just make sure if there's any questions, we take them first.
Sure. So we'll wait a minute or two if you do have a question, just either you can feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat. Sarah, have you been keeping up with the Q&A panel? Has anybody submitted any questions through that?
We have. I think we've reconciled any questions.
Okay,
So,
great.
including my last one I submitted myself.
Did you answer it yourself as well?
You answered it. Yeah, you were
Oh,
great.
okay.
All right. Well, I do have one question, Wale, because I know for myself personally and professionally, this has been a lot of information to take in.
Mhm.
Where would you suggest we start, if both in organizational work, but like in our own personal practice of ensuring we're accessible?
That's a good question. So this is a lot of content and it could be pretty dense. What we always tell folks to remember is that accessibility is a process. You're not going to get there in one day, and don't try to get everything right on the first try. What I recommend is just to slowly build more and more of this into your process. In terms of getting started, I would maybe focus on, something that is pretty, hopefully low hanging fruit and easy. Focus on describing images. The next time you, and don't wait till you have to send it to a blind person. Just make it a practice that you always do.
Great.
Okay.
Thanks so much. Great
Um,
advisement.
Yep. So yeah, the next email you send, the next screenshot you send, try to add alt text to it. The next social media post, try to add alt text to it and start from there.
Okay, I know a number of people had to drop off. They said they had other meetings they had to go to, but are looking forward to getting the recording and the information so they can go back to it and revisit it, all of the expertise advice offered today. Final call for questions. Okay, well, thank you so much for being here, to our attendees, and have a wonderful day.
All right, thanks all.